This is the fifth in the series of talks on Metta Meditation, and we've talked so far about practice of mindful awareness, being clearly and calmly aware of one's own thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations and so on. And then we talked about starting up the metta practice and starting with making the words of metta very clear. May I be happy, enunciating and defining them clearly. And then bringing in the dimension of meaning, reminding ourselves of the meaning of metta, what we're doing. And then using that to evoke the feeling. So actually experience what it means to feel metta. And then when that feeling is stabilized and fairly clear within one place in the body, then to gradually spread that out through the whole body, moving the mind through the different parts of the body until you can feel every part of the body saturated with the feeling of loving kindness. And then holding that sense of full body awareness clearly, holding the image within the mind of the whole body, and trying to sustain that for as long as you can. And we consider the first part of metta practice fully completed if you can sustain that feeling for, say, 20 minutes to half an hour, once you've reached that stage. And if you can do that, then we move to the second stage of metta for the loved person we talked about last week. And in that stage we're keeping the mind exactly the same as it was before, and simply changing the words of loving kindness to include that loved person within the loving kindness practice. So what I'd like to do this week is to try to consolidate what we've learnt so far. I won't teach any more new stages this week, but just to give some more reflections and time on what we've done so far. One thing I've noticed about metta meditation, teaching metta meditation, is that it tends to be very individual. People's responses to it are very individual. Some people find the metta comes very naturally, very easily. They just have to think of it or call it up, and there it is. The feelings of loving kindness, they come. And for people who that feeling comes very easily, then their job is to refine that, make it steady. Some people, especially if people tend to be over-emotional, excitable characters, then the metta is too much. It becomes too strong. The rapture is too strong, it's out of balance. And so if that's the case, then you need to learn to just turn the mind towards the peacefulness of the meditation. And for other people, it seems that they just can't get any feeling of metta going at all. That their mind seems very dry and there's no real feeling or response there. So some people like that. Some people also just don't like to do metta meditation. Sometimes it seems that people don't like to do it just because of laziness sometimes. It feels like you have to actually do something. I don't want to do anything in my meditation. Oh my God, I've been doing enough things. You're giving me more things to do. But it's very important to notice this. There's sometimes this laziness in the mind. And this is something that I learned when I was doing yoga. And I originally started doing yoga because when I was playing guitar, I'd get like RSI in my wrists and so on, and I'd get a sore back from my posture playing guitar and so on. And so I did yoga to try to help those problems. And I thought that yoga would make me more flexible and sort of stretch me out so that I didn't have those problems. What I found out when I was doing it was that it only really works, the flexibility only really works if you put effort into it. It's not merely a matter of just flopping into a posture and just relaxing. Relaxation isn't just about, just flopping around. The more you exert, the more effort you put in, then the deeper the relaxation becomes. And you all know what that's like, don't you? You all know that, for example, if you've probably had the experience if you say on holidays, and maybe you've got nothing to do, or maybe you just laze around all day not doing anything. But if you don't feel your body doesn't feel necessarily that relaxed, and actually if you can feel your body get quite tense if it's just lying around all day. Whereas if you're going out and exercising, maybe you go swimming in the day or something like that, and you come back and your body's really exhausted, then you have a much more deeper relaxation. So it's important to notice this tendency in the mind that we tend to want to be a bit lazy when we come to meditation and not want to do anything. So it takes a little bit of work. One of the main problems or main issues which of course people bring up with me in metta meditation very frequently is the question about, they say it's very hard to develop metta for oneself. And it is interesting because certainly as far as the Pali texts go, it seems to be pretty much taken for granted that having metta for oneself is the most kind of basic or most obvious or easiest way to develop metta. And certainly that's how it's presented in the Visuddhimagga as well. And that metta for others is something that's developed on that basis. And that's also something which seems logical just from a biological or evolutionary perspective, that any organism has to first look after itself. First priority for survival is to take care of yourself. Second priority for survival is to take care of your immediate family, usually. And then gradually, little bit by little bit, we extend that sphere of concern out from there to encompass those who are not immediately related to, maybe people in the same tribe, and then maybe people in the same nation, and then we realize all people in the whole world, and we realize, not just the people, also the animals too, other beings. And so we gradually extend this sphere of concern, this sphere of metta, sphere of compassion, the sphere of feeling out from oneself, based on the recognition that just as we feel, so too those other beings also feel. So this certainly seems logical, and it certainly relates to the normal or the natural way that our minds develop. I don't know if it's possible for a mind to develop in any other way. I doubt it very much. And yet, again and again, we hear these problems of low self-esteem. And I'm sure you've probably all heard of there's a very famous episode once when a group of Western practitioners were talking with the Dalai Lama, and one of them asked him, "What do I do about this problem of low self-esteem?" And he said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And he said, like low self-esteem. And they couldn't translate the concept into Tibetan. They didn't have a word for it. And then he sort of had to explain what it means. It means, well, I really just don't think I'm a really good person, and I just think that I'm kind of worse than everybody else, and then I'm not really worthy of being happy and loved and so on. He said, that's crazy. Do you really feel like that? That's appalling. That's terrible. He said, yeah. And then he asked all the other people, do you feel like that as well? And most of them said, yeah, I feel like that as well. So he's starting to learn a thing or two about Western psychology. So why is that? Why is that in the West we have this low sense of self-esteem? And I'm sure there are many complex reasons. One reason, and I think we'll all due respect to our Christian friends, but one reason has to be laid at the door of the way that Christianity, some forms of Christianity, and especially Catholicism, have been practiced at times in the past. Whether they're still practiced in that way is another matter, but certainly if you look at much of the older Christian ethos, it was very much about you're a worm, you're nothing in the sight of God, you're just this meaningless blob of mud, that's all you are. And they quite deliberately and consciously set out to destroy individual sense of self and sense of self-worth. And that was quite explicit and clear, for example, in the training of the Jesuits that was laid down by what's his name? Ignatius Loyola, I think. And there was the whole psychology of it was actually to completely reduce you to nothing until you're basically on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and then to sort of you're sort of lying there in the mud in the lowest dungeon, kind of naked and depressed and suicidal, and then they just like open the door a tiny crack and say, but there is hope, and that hope is Jesus, the hope is the Lord. You're nothing, you're rubbish, but the Lord is everything. And so this is how they trained very fanatical disciples, and their training techniques were in fact, as I understand, adopted by various other people, such as the Gestapo and others. And if you read, for example, Karen Armstrong's biography, her story about her time as a nun, and then you'll realize that the days of those kinds of extreme behaviours are not in the not too distant past. They were still doing similar things. So I think this kind of the residue of this is part of the mix, part of what's going on. Another part of the mix is what's sometimes called the Western neurosis. And this is basically the split or the gulf, the canyon, the chasm in between, which manifests in many different ways, but the chasm between the mind and the body, or between faith and reason, depending on how you want to formulate it. And this has been like this struggle in Western traditions, is inherited. It's basically from two traditions, the Greek rational philosophical tradition on one hand, and then the Judaic faith tradition on the other, and the kind of 2,000-year-old battle to reconcile these conceptions. And very often we find, as indeed we can see today, we find the battle between the fundamentalist intelligent design crew and the Darwinian evolutionists, who kind of still battling out these same kinds of things, and fighting the same wars that should have been over such a long time ago. And all these battles which are based on what is actually just unprovable assertions. The Christians basing it on this unprovable assertion that there is a thing which exists which is called God, which you can't see or smell or taste or touch, but it's somehow the most important thing in the world. And then the materialists or the scientists basing their attack on this on the view of the monastic view that there's only one kind of substance in the world, which is matter. And of course matter is something we can never experience. We can only ever experience the mind. And so the idea that matter truly exists in the world is just as much of a philosophical, unprovable assertion as is the existence of God. And so they're kind of going at it hammer and tongs, and it still excites this tremendous interest. And so what this is a sign of is the signs in the psychological dimension of this split between different halves of the mind, different halves of the brain, the faith and the reason. And so I think this also is an important factors leading to this idea of low self-esteem. Because our mind is split, we don't develop that sense of appreciation for our own good qualities. And so this is something you can notice actually in your own mind when you're using your mind in different ways. For example, sometimes you'll be thinking logically, maybe you're working through a problem or going over something. Another time maybe you're thinking empathetically, or you're just sort of feeling something out. It's like different ways of using the mind. But we tend to antagonize these things rather than acknowledging them and using them both as being part of our skills. They're actually both of them incredibly powerful and valuable ways of being conscious, irreplaceable. And yet because we want to only value one side and then reject the other, and so then we feel like a lack of sense of self-worth. And this can manifest sometimes in various behaviours and so on as well. I mean, just from my own experience, for example, as you know, I tend to err on the kind of intellectual thinking, abstract side. And this is my character. And it always has been. And so I grew up in an environment where that was not particularly valued. And I grew up in Perth, and in a boys' school in Perth, I went to school where sport was very much valued. And if you could play footy and you could play cricket and stuff, then that was really cool. But sort of reading Nietzsche and things like that was pretty down there on the list of cool things to do. So I guess maybe that's why I took up playing guitar or something like that as a kind of compensation. And so I found I've always this is something I've noticed as a pattern in my life, that even though my tendency is very kind of sort of rational and logical, and you might expect me to have sort of taken a career or university course that emphasised those kinds of things, but actually I tend to kind of put myself in sort of creative or artistic kind of environments, playing music or being with people who much more err on that other side of being very imaginative and so on. So I've noticed this through my life. It's quite interesting. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why I've done that is because of that feeling that there's something lacking, or that I need something to balance that intellectual side, and feeling like there's something missing. So this is another issue. And then another one, I think, which is very important, is family problems. And I think in our society, modern society, we have a much greater incidence of family issues than in more traditional societies. Much higher incidence of divorce, and people being brought up in single families and all of these kinds of situations. And I think that has a big influence on this. Even the very idea of the nuclear family, just mum and dad and the kids, is quite different from how most people are brought up in an extended family, most parts of the world. And so there's always somebody around. You're living in the extended family, there's always a grandma or auntie or cousins or somebody else around to hold you, to look after you, to be there, and all of those things. Whereas we get put in a situation where maybe we're brought up and mum and dad aren't around a lot, they're going out to work, or maybe they're divorced and spend time arguing with each other and all of these kinds of things. And so I mean there's various degrees of that, all the way from outright abuse and so on, all the way up to maybe just a feeling of just missing the more extended family. But I think this is also a powerful impact on how we feel, how whole and balanced we are emotionally. So there's not a lot that we can do about that, really. Maybe you can, next lifetime, you can get born with my parents or something like that. A very good mum and dad, even though my parents were divorced, but it was still very loving. So of course we can deal and address these things in many ways, and of course this is one area where psychotherapy is the kind of the specializes in looking at these kinds of problems and issues and things like that. So maybe that's useful if these things are important for you. But I think this is another area. Sometimes just enough to acknowledge these things. Another cause, and another one I think is fairly obvious, is just the competitiveness of modern life and the fast pace, and there's so many new things and stuff, and it's very, very hard to keep up. We're demanding a lot of competence. And in the workplace and university and so on, it's all very much result orientated. We have to achieve certain levels, and we're judged by that. And it's very cruel, you know. I remember being with my mum one time. She was a school teacher, and she was marking the end of year exams of the girls at her school, and you know, I was kind of sitting there, we were talking and so on, and kind of watching the way you did it, and there was this cut-off line, you know. There's this cut-off line where if you got 1 mark more than that, you passed, and if you got 1 mark less than that, you failed. I said to my mum, how can you do that? How can you say you've passed and then say to someone else, you've failed? They're basically the same, you know. There's hardly any difference between them, and yet one of them's a success and one of them's a failure. How can you do that? So of course you have to, you have to do these things. And the modern world emphasizes this so much, you know, getting results, and we're always feeling challenged. There's always new skills to learn, new technologies to learn, new situations to try to cope with, and there's always the pressure. And so this is very much a source of, you know, we tend to invest ourselves in external standards rather than just looking at who we are, and realizing that our sense of worth is not based on, you know, what we do or our success or our income level or all of these kinds of things. A very memorable bumper sticker driving through Sydney one time, and then on the back of a very late model, I think it was a BMW or a Porsche, it had a sticker, whoever dies with more toys wins. I thought that was great because it was just so honest, you know. So this is another issue, it's another problem there. And so I think once we can identify these various issues or possible issues or causes, now they might be more or less obvious for you, then we can start to get a handle on them and start to do something about them. Some issues maybe, like I mentioned, the kind of the war between faith and reason and the kind of the history of Western thought and so on. I mean, that's pretty abstract. I mean, to me it seems very important because I study history and I look at how these things play out in time, and I see that these things have an impact on people. But I think in the reality of people's lives, they don't really notice it. But it still is very important. But the thing to do there is just to recognize and to value both one's emotional side and one's intellectual side without feeling the need to denigrate these, and to denigrate either of them. It's not a matter of one's right and one's wrong, or one's better and one's worse. It's a matter of understanding and integrating them in an appropriate way. And those of you who've heard my teaching for a while or read my first book would know that this is very much how I see the stress in modern Buddhism between samatha and vipassana. I think that this is an import of the split, the mind-body or the faith and reason split, which has been such a problem in the West. And I believe that this was imported from the West into Burma specifically in the 19th century during the colonial era, when the British were very scornful and critical of the local religious practices that they saw, which would have been largely the kind of animist religious magical practices associated with popular Buddhism, and being very critical of that, then the local Buddhist traditions all around the world develop their response to that critique. And that response is what we call modernist Buddhism, and which encompasses every form of Buddhism that you're likely to see in the world, unless you go to the back hills of Bhutan or something like that. And so all of these forms of Buddhism we've seen, whether Zen or Tibetan or Theravada or whatever, they've all been invented in the last 100, 150 years as a response to the colonial threat in the modern era. And in different ways they've responded to this by trying to, essentially by trying to rationalize Buddhism. And in the sphere of meditation, especially Theravada meditation, that rationalism came in the form of a very strong denigration of Samita meditation, which is the emotional part of meditation, and the almost exclusive exaltation of vipassana. And so this I see very much as being an import of Western neuroses into Buddhist meditation. So this is one practical way that we can try to work with this problem, is simply to not buy into that argument, to value and to cherish the worth of the different aspects of meditation, the emotional aspects of samatha, the intelligential aspects of vipassana, and to develop and practice these both in harmony and integration. This is important. Another thing that's very important for developing the sense of self-worth, of course, is just very simple cognitive work. Okay, so just paying attention to how you think. This, of course, is the second factor of the Eightfold Path. And all the kind of critical and negative thoughts. So, of course, when we're having all the critical and negative thoughts, then almost invariably they're springing from some kind of sense of lack of self-worth. We're not confident and happy and content within ourselves. And so we either directly criticize ourselves, or we disguise the fact that we're criticizing ourselves and we externalize that and project the flaws and faults onto others. And this manifests as all of the critical thinking and all of these kinds of things. So it's very, very true that if you're having a lot of critical thoughts and negative thinking, then you will not be able to develop metta. Give up. You're hopeless. If you can't stop having critical thoughts, then you're completely hopeless. Right? Fortunately, you can stop having negative thoughts. Okay, this is not beyond the reach of anybody. It's not all that difficult. All it takes is a bit of mindfulness and a bit of resolution. Mindfulness, you realize, this is a negative thought, this is a critical thought, and then just don't think it. Then just think something else. Bring something to mind that's happy. Even if you have to force yourself, even if it's artificial, even if you don't want to, even if there's that pull in the mind, that strain that's wanting to go there. It's like trying to niggle that painful feeling, trying to get in there and scratch the itch, but don't do it, just resist. Reflect on that. We've already learnt these kinds of reflections through our study of the suttas. We learn the different ways of reflecting on wrong thoughts. And we cut off the cycle of thoughts and just think good thoughts. Think thoughts of appreciation, thoughts of gratitude, thoughts of kindness. It doesn't have to be profound thoughts. It doesn't have to be the world's most amazing thoughts. Just ordinary, everyday, nice thoughts. And then this creates a positive emotional vibe in the brain and in the body and in the mind. And from that basis, then it's easy to develop metta. So this one is very, very important. As far as the issue of one's family and so on is concerned, then this is something that we all should take great care with. One of the features, again, the features of modern Western culture is kind of the rebelliousness of the youth. And very often, if we've grown up in this kind of culture, we've been through a phase when we've rebelled against our parents. And sometimes maybe justifiably, sometimes maybe they have done things wrong. But nevertheless, that's always a wrench. There's always a pain there. And so this is a very important thing for us to do, is to develop a sense of forgiveness for our parents. To be able to forgive them. This is something that's very, very hard to do. I remember some of you saw the John Safran program where he was having the exorcism and having all of the bad spirits taken out of him, and then one of the preliminary things, this evangelist who was supposedly treating him, he said, "Now I want you," because John Safran of course is Jewish, so he said to him, "Okay, I want you to repeat after me. I forgive Hitler." He's like, I forgive Hitler. So this is what you have to do. And whoever your Hitler is, you have to forgive them. It doesn't mean to say that what they did is okay, of course not. So this is what we have to do. And sometimes if we need to, then this can be something we can do something externally. You can send a card or make a phone call or these kinds of things. Sometimes we've had grudges against people for a long time, and we're kind of bearing those grudges in our heart, and they make it hard for us. And so sometimes it could just a little message, a little card or a little email can solve those problems, and just say, oh, okay, then that all just disappears. So sometimes that's the way to do it. Other times it's just something that you have to do within yourself. Just find the sense of forgiveness within yourself. And so this is like the work that you have to do to create this sense of emotional wholeness and health. Be able to be content with yourself and content with others. So are there any questions or comments on that before we do some guided meditation? Okay, let's do a little bit of a sitting. Sitting quietly. Focusing the sense of awareness inwards. When thoughts come into the mind, we just note them, thinking, thinking, thinking. Thinking, thinking, thinking. Leaving the mind in the heart, and bring up the words, may I be happy, may I be happy, may I be happy. Allowing the feeling of metta to arise, soft and gentle, feeling of happiness and joy. letting the feeling of metta spread out through the whole body. And holding in the mind the perception of the whole body filled with metta. And metta for a loved person. May that loved one be happy. May they be happy. May they be happy. Just putting the name of the loved person into the words of metta. Holding them inside your own body. Holding that feeling of metta right in there. Coming back to oneself, may I be happy, may I be happy, may I be happy. And letting the words of metta go, letting the feeling of metta fade away, allowing the mind to return to a neutral space, empty, open and clear. And take a minute to review over the meditation, inquiring into cause and effect. What just happened? How did I apply my mind to that meditation? How did my mind change during meditation? How does my mind now compare with how it was at the start of the meditation? And finally, we can dedicate the merit of our practice. May all beings be happy, may all beings be well, may all beings rejoice in the merit that we've made through our practice. May all beings finally realize Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So are there any questions? Comments? Anyone have any good jokes perhaps?
Tonight you were like your little silver teapot pouring out really cool, clear water of good sense.
Thank you, Eva. There's Eva's simile of the teapot.
What are the external conditions we can develop so that we can able to appreciate ourselves, or be able to
External conditions?
or some particular problem that Westerners are dealing with? What is the external condition?
I think the most important external condition is having good friendship, kalyana mitta, and being in a good community of people, supportive people, and having a healthy balance of support and also diversity. Not trying to be with people who are always the same as you all the time, but not being with people who are too different either. There needs to be that kind of balance, because then if you have some differences, then people appreciate everybody's unique contribution, so that's useful. I don't think you can really overestimate that.
What about faith-based practices?
Yeah, faith-based practices are very good. Yeah. Puja, and 3 steps, 1 bow. Maybe we can do that. We can go from unknown to Ayers Rock. 3 steps, 1 bow. What do you reckon?
Thailand sounds good this time.
I think that'd be too far. You'd get wet. I don't know if they let you keep on doing it on the aeroplane. Yeah. So, but that's true. That's another. It's interesting that from Westerners we have that kind of problem with those kinds of practices. Sometimes people don't like to bow. And you see these things. I mean, it says all through the Old Testament. It says, bowing to graven images, you're going to go to hell. And see, Western people, they don't like to bow. Anyone else is fine to bow. And I remember when talking to, it was very clear when I was in Thailand. I heard a story of my friend Somjit, whose place I was staying at. He told a story of how he had been picked up at a train station in Japan. It's what they call flirty fishing. And so they get this kind of, attractive young lady to come up to all the guys and say, come to my place and there's this really good thing going on. And they get there and there's this kind of evangelical Christian thing. And they had all these people who'd been kind of picked up by this flirty fishing method. And they were supposed to go through this ritual thing. And it was interesting, he said that all of the Asians were quite happy to do the ritual thing. It was like a ritual bathing thing. They were all quite happy to do it, and then none of the Westerners who were there would. It was quite interesting, that difference, that from if you're not from a Christian background, you haven't got that ingrained in you, then you're quite happy to go along with the forms of a religion. It's not an issue, to go into a church and to bow at the church or something like that. People are quite happy to do that. Whereas from the Western perspective, it's the other way around. It's quite, it's obviously getting better now. It's not so bad, but it certainly has been that way. So there's this resistance to doing faith practices, and the very fact that there's resistance is a sign that there's something that needs looking at.
Can we do more faith-based practices?
Can we do more? How many do you want?
Enough to address the issue, I suppose.
Enough to address the issue, yeah. That's true. I mean, and that's why, in communities, monastic communities, you do group practices and monastic practices. It helps support, so that's good. But just doing the puja every morning is really good. Other faith-based practices are there. If you want to suggest some, I'm happy to think about it.
The thought that comes to me hearing you talk about putting aside negative feelings is how deeply ingrained images and conditioning is if you're part of a target group or if you've been oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just, when you talked about Christianity, then that didn't really resonate so much with me, but more what it means to have grown up in South Africa as a Jew and also being targeted as activists and growing up in cultures that consistently speak about you negatively. That it's so deeply ingrained that so that it feels like that process of putting it aside is a sort of continual process of opening and allowing those energies, and then as they subside, sort of coming back in. It's sort of like the deeper you go, the more you find. It isn't just like this one-off thing.
Yeah. What was it that Mel said before the talk? Just deal with your issues and get over it. Go on, sorry. So are you going to say, Irina?
No, I just found for myself and for a lot of other people in teaching Metta that it's a very that it's radical and also not easy.
Yeah.
You know, if you've had those kind of experiences.
Sure. Yeah, it's not a kind of marshmallow practice. Seems like it. Maybe it should be. Ideally, it should be. Yeah. It's a kind of fluffy bunny practice. But I guess there's no option, really. It's part of the path, so we don't have any getting around it. You have to face up to it sooner or later.
I think that's where the mindfulness practice really helps, is that when the Metta lifts so much up, having mindfulness, you know, to help process it and hold it is really helpful. The Vipassana type of mindfulness.
Another quality not talked too much about in Theravada is mudita, which I find myself is quite a good practice. Because
for sure.
It counters criticism itself in arati.
Yeah, that's right. The most direct counteract to critical thinking is mudita.
Yes, when we develop mudita for ourselves, we learn to appreciate ourselves and see the good qualities in ourselves, because we're very critical and sin with ourselves. And gratitude is another quality.
And again, to develop those things, just to start. It doesn't matter how you can have mudita about yourself or anything. It doesn't matter how silly it is. You know, it's the quality of the mind that's really important, that goes in the right direction. It'll get deep when it needs to be. Yeah. But it can be even like, I managed to shave without cutting myself this morning. Sadhu, sadhu, it's wonderful. Because it is wonderful. Yeah? How can you, if you try to design a robot to be able to shave itself, you couldn't do it. Yeah? So we can't, these things we do without even being able to think about it. We open the door for somebody and let somebody else through and and you can say, like, for the first time in my life ever, I didn't take the biggest piece of cake. It's like, sadhu, 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 it's wonderful. That's good. Well, that's my effort for this lifetime. And it doesn't matter how small it is, but it's the attitude of mind that's important.
Is having met with many people ever contradictory to having met with a few?
Yes. I think this is one of the struggles that we have to develop as... Actually, I think it's actually like a crucial struggle that we have to develop as our own consciousness and sphere of moral concern expands. I mentioned this briefly a bit earlier, but when you go from like a family base to a tribal base, from a tribal base to thinking in terms of larger communities, and there's always this wrench, and it's a very bad battle. You can see this is very strong. It seems to me is very strong in the States, maybe not quite so strong here these days, with just being able to see the difference between having a world-centric point of view, where you realise actually it's humans that are important, and having a very nationalistic point of view. And so you can see all this kind of concern is like, how many American dead are there in the Iraq War? Yeah? As if somehow American lives are worth counting. Well, that's exactly how they think. American lives are worth counting. One of the reasons being that they're actually countable, whereas the amount of Iraqi lives that have been lost is probably 100 times as many, but it's not actually countable. They don't even bother trying to count them. So, and it seems that, and when you're in that position, then for somebody to say it's not can you imagine that somebody in a position of power or influence in America to get up and say, well, it doesn't matter whether it's American lives lost or not, it's whether it's human lives lost or not, that's the important thing. And of course you'd immediately be seen as being a traitor, you're not patriotic, you're un-American. And so that's just an example, but this is the kind of thing where I think every time you have to transcend from one level to like a higher level, then there's always that tug. There's always a pull backwards, and there's always forces which are trying to keep you back into the same level and stop you from transcending. Always those narrow interest groups. Same thing applies anywhere. If you're in a company or a department or something like that, there's always this kind of central interest group that's trying to stop you from helping others.
Sangho